what that means for rural areas. And so I'm here really just to give you a brief introduction to set the tone, just to remind everyone that we have opened up the chat and the Q&A. We will encourage you to put your questions in the chat after each speaker. Please put their last name and then pose your question. We've been asking our speakers to actively engage in the chat and in the Q&A to respond to questions as they come up. So please don't feel that you have to wait until the end. Please use the chat and use the Q&A for discussion. And certainly use the chat to introduce yourself and let us know who you are and where you are at the moment. And if you have any questions that are broader, please post them there as well, because we will be picking questions from that session to raise it up later. So as I said before, Lisa, you can go to the next slide. This is really part of the Rural Principles series. And to just remind you that we at the OECD, we put out Principles of Rural Policy. These are the broad strokes, what they represent. And this series focuses on the economic aspect of that, but everything we do around the webinars will be linked to the series because we are trying to learn about different aspects of the principles within inside countries. And these series are designed to help us do that. With that in mind, this webinar is brought to you today in collaboration with the government of Netherlands, and we are so excited to always do these discussions in collaboration with countries because it allows us to learn more and to get more in-depth and to be in sync with a lot of the discussions that need to be had in country. So I'm going to turn it over to Gerben Bierman, the head of Just Transition, and ask him to present some opening remarks and to get us going. Gerben, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Betty-Ann, and welcome to everyone. It's great that there is so much interest in this topic. My name is Gerben Bierman. I work at the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, Food, Fishery and Nature. And that also includes economic resilience in rural areas. And as you may know, Dutch rural areas are not that sparsely populated. They are not that difficult to travel to. But as it was already remarked by the OECD, the rural areas all over the world are very different. And also the Dutch rural areas face quite some challenges as well. Most of them have to do with all kinds of environmental measures that have to be taken in the next decades. For example, nitrogen reduction, water quality, sustainable agriculture. And as a ministry, we are very much aware that might also give rise to some tensions, societal tensions, social cultural tensions in these rural areas. And we strongly believe that economic resilience is a very important ingredient, a very important, one might say, a medication towards these tensions. So we've been doing some research ourselves on this topic. Eva and Afke, two colleagues of mine, will present something about that later. But we're also very much looking forward to hearing all the wisdom from all over the world that is gathered in this call. So, thanks again, Betty-Ann, for organizing this webinar, for bringing so much knowledge together, and we're really looking forward to hearing all the presentations and the discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and we'll go right into our next our kind of first speaker to really set the tone for this conversation, to kind of give us a broad view of what's going on. So the factors that could improve resilience in rural economies. And we've asked Craig Poulet, former Chief Executive Officer of the Municipalities of Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada, to kind of frame this discussion for us, because he has both a public and a private sector experience. So Craig, the floor is yours, please. And your presentation is coming up.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Betty Ann. Very happy to be here. Delighted to be invited to speak to such an impressive group. And as Jurgen said, I hope I don't disappoint. It's a big mandate. So we could probably go to the first slide, please. Or the second slide, I guess, technically. Thanks very much. So I want to give you a little bit of context because I do come from a very specific place. I'm in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador in the country of Canada. And we have, as Jurgen has already alluded to, a very different kind of rural than a lot of other parts of the country. It's quite different across our country. Canada is the second largest landmass in terms of nations in the world. And we have a very rural population, a very spread out rural population. Oh, did we lose our slides? There we go. Excellent. So 18, depending on how you measure it, 18 to 30% of the population of Canada is rural. And we have, as countries do, many, many measures of rural. If you go strictly with, sub 10,000 population, it's about 18%. If you look at non-metropolitan areas, so under 100,000, it's 30%. In my part of Canada, in Newfoundland and Labrador, the rural population makes up 42% of the total population. We're a very rural place. Right across Canada, including my province, primarily natural resource extraction, so about 30% of GDP comes from, or the value of, comes from rural places. We've got challenges, we've got opportunities. There's obviously economic restructuring happening, which is happening all over the world. There's an aging population in rural communities, and in most rural communities, aging at a faster rate than in most urban centers. There are infrastructure and service deficits as populations are decreasing, infrastructure is degrading, services are being withdrawn, in particular public services. And there is this, we've been calling it here, retreat from rural. There is a sense that the population in rural communities is getting smaller, mainly because older folks are moving into urban centers for access to services. But we do have, most rural places represent the kind of sectors that are growing in our economy. Those natural resource extraction sectors in Canada are driving the economy. We have tremendous quality of life and natural amenities that post-COVID are becoming a much more important issue for people's decisions on where they want to live. And there's very strong social cohesion and a very different kind of social cohesion than you would see in large urban centers. One of the challenges is the way our country is set up constitutionally. In terms of governance, we have a very weak local government system. We are weak within the OECD, and within Canada, my part of the country, Newfoundland and Labrador, is weaker again. And there is this sort of constitutional mismatch. The national government, the federal government, has most of the tax revenue. The provincial governments have most of the tangible authority to do things. They have the strongest programs and capacity to act. Municipalities have neither. Local governments are what we call here, unfortunately, creatures of the province. They don't exist in the Constitution. They are created by provincial legislation. So it puts them in a very dependent situation vis-a-vis the higher orders of government. Next slide, please. So given that context, given that that's what we deal with here, what are the factors behind rural resilience? And I think there are many, many, many factors behind rural resilience. You're going to hear about a lot of them this afternoon. I've picked four, and these are not necessarily the four that everybody would pick, but for our context, and I think for a lot of contexts out there, this is what works. Capacity. Rural communities need capacity. They need financial capacity in order to deliver programs, in order to make investments. In our context, as I just mentioned, local governments or regional entities, and I'll get into what regional means here in a second, don't have that kind of financial capacity. They don't have the taxing capacity to do what needs to be done. Technical capacity. What do you do if you have the financial capacity? What do you do with it? Well, partially you build up your technical capacity or your professional capacity to act on programs, to develop programs, to invest in infrastructure. And they certainly don't have the human capacity. In this part of the world, in this part of Canada, most municipalities, I think 74%, have a single staff person or fewer. So they're very small, very under capacity. If we're going to tackle rural well-being and rural development, devolved capacity has to be part of that. Authority. And this change, this is different depending on the context that you're in, but certainly in our context and in many others that I've looked at, the ability to make decisions and act on those decisions is incredibly important. And when you're designing a national or subnational rural development strategy, rural well-being strategy, whether you're rural proofing, the authority of local communities to act on their own behalf is critical. And whether you measure it, again, by capacity or legislative authority, it needs to be there. Thirdly, and this one, I've sort of grouped a bunch together here, but I call it integration. Economic development, infrastructure, healthcare services, education services, the infrastructure associated with healthcare and education. These things need to be connected. Many governments will plan education investments or healthcare investments or transportation investments without connecting the dots between those aspects of service delivery and public services. And that doesn't really work. And we're finding that here in this country in particular, that there are silos of organizations making decisions about investments that don't connect to one another. And it's incredibly important that it happen. And it's about higher orders of government working with lower orders of government. It's also about communities working with one another, and not just rural communities sort of banding together to help one another. All of the communities within a region. It's incredibly important. We see this here, that rural communities and urban communities within a region understand their symbiotic relationship and understand the very tangible way in which their futures are connected. That's going to be the core. Rural communities, for most economies like Canada and in Newfoundland and Labrador, because of natural resource dependence, they're going to be at the core of the regional economic engine for their area. The urban centers are the service and administrative support for that development. You've got to link those two in order to make that potential real. And lastly, this idea of frameworks or strategies. There needs to be a plan. If we had local governments or regions with all the capacity they could possibly want, with the authority they need to make decisions on their own behalf, if investments were integrated and communities and their activities are integrated, you still need a framework, as simple as that sounds, for all those things to work within. Humans need to know where they're going. And if they don't have that, either as a higher order of government framework for rural development or as a regional strategic economic plan, for example, not going to get very far. Now, next slide, please. So what's happened in Canada in terms of that kind of support to and how we do rural policy? For many years, Canada had something called a rural secretariat. The rural secretariat was a whole of government effort. It was a small group of people within the provincial government or within the federal government. It was the department that linked all other departments, and it provided a lot of support to rural communities. That was eliminated in 2013. The government at the time took a different kind of approach, and I'm going to talk about this in 1 second. Today, we do have a rural economic development minister. There is a minister responsible for rural economic development. She has a small department supporting her. We have a Centre for Rural Economic Development that actually rests in another department, answering to another minister, but connected to this one. And Federally, we have regional development agencies. In my part of Canada, there's the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. All of these entities have moved from what I would call a place-based approach, so coming up with rural development strategies, and have moved to a market-based approach where they will support business development. And if that development happens in a rural place, then that's rural economic development. They do a fairly good job of integrating cross-national policies like broadband internet access, but they're not really doing anything to fundamentally change the nature of rural places. In Newfoundland and Labrador, we've seen the same sort of change. We used to have regional entities, regional economic development boards that had municipal representatives, union representatives, business representatives, all working towards a plan, coordinating work within their region. Those were eliminated around the same time, 2012, 2013. And that's where we really started to see a shift. So now in Newfoundland and Labrador, regional economic development is a small division within a larger Department of Industry, Energy, and Technology. So again, that place-based approach has shifted to more of a market-based approach. In this part of the world, nonprofits are filling gaps. Nonprofits are stepping in to try to create capacity within regions that has been abandoned by higher orders of government. That's not a sustainable strategy. Very recently, we have seen some moves towards the federal and provincial governments moving towards more robust rural economic development strategies. They are starting to create these frameworks that I talked about earlier. We're coming back to that. They're not sort of fundamentally or aimed at fundamentally changing the nature of rural communities or their ability to develop themselves. They're connecting dots within the provincial or the federal governments, but it's a start. In the provincial government here, we now have a Deputy Minister of Rural and Regional Development and Engagement, who is also the Chief Economic Development Officer, who's in charge of developing this strategy. So it's a whole of government approach, but small staff, one champion. We'll see where it goes. Next slide, please. So to conclude, what I'm seeing in Canada, and I think it's important as we look around the world in terms of how rural development happens, how rural well-being is emphasized, we do seem to be moving towards a market versus place-based approach to policy. The idea, again, if you make any investment, infrastructure, commercial, whatever, in a rural place, then it is rural development, has sort of taken a hold here, as opposed to the idea that you should design a strategy for rural places that are based on the capacities of and the assets of those rural places. There's a shift from planning to action, especially at the political level. And the political level in Canada right now is driving a lot of our economic development policy. Planning is seen as doing, or action is seen as doing. Planning is seen as sort of waiting to do. And the emphasis is on action. And of course, without a plan, quite often that action is not useful. When we do create plans, they're not really fulsome. They don't have a lot of measurable targets. So how does that relate back to the factors that I mentioned earlier? Well, municipal capacity continues to be weak in Canada. As I mentioned earlier, most of our local governments have very few staff. They're very, very small. For a population of 520,000 in my province, we have 275 local governments. 50% of them have fewer than 500 people. So we're very rural. Capacity is a big deal. Most, and this gets back to a democratic efficacy issue, most don't require a contested election. Every 4 years we have municipal elections. About half of them actually have more people running than seats to fill. The rest don't require an election. There were recent attempts to build stronger regional governance entities, which were really rebuffed by the provincial government. I don't think the provincial government saw the need to create stronger sub-provincial entities. What they're focusing on doing right now is providing some limited administrative support to this large fragmented sector. there's no real increase in capacity or autonomy or authority. Formal regional structures would have absolutely provided the venue for that crucial rural-urban conversation. I can give you an example. I'm working with some of the large wind hydrogen projects that are happening in this province. A model is being used here to bring communities together to sort of address what they want out of these large industrial projects. And the model was taken from other parts of Canada where they had strong municipal governments and that have worked really well. In this province, the capacity of local communities to engage in those larger projects is just not there. So the system is not working. Had we had that capacity there to begin with, we would have been in a better position. Given our lack of focus on planning, not surprising that we're pretty weak when it comes to integration. We make these decisions in silos still. We won't really, like I said, even if we give all the capacity we want to the local level, without this integration at a policy level above municipalities, it's not really going to move things forward. There is some integration, collaboration happening in regions, but it's sporadic and it's without a framework to support it. It happens when municipalities have the capacity to do it. In terms of a framework, frameworks are nascent here. I mentioned that there is a national rural economic development strategy. It was only released late last year, so it hasn't really proven itself. And the one for Newfoundland and Labrador is just being developed. It is extremely heartening to see that this kind of effort is being put forward right now. It's desperately needed. It remains to be seen whether these strategies create circumstances to support rural communities versus empowering and fundamentally changing rural communities. And I think I'd like to finish here with just, I want to sort of do a throwback to the late 1990s. In this country, we did a lot of work on empowering regions and pushing authority down, pushing resources down to regions. In this province, we had regional economic development boards that were multi-stakeholders that did regional economic plans. As the political tide shifted to more market-based decision-making versus place-based, all of those efforts were sort of pushed aside. I think it's time for us to sort of look back at what worked from that time period and see if we can take what we learned from that and build on it for the future. So that's all I have to say. That was helpful, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Craig. I appreciate your presentation. I appreciate the emphasis on integrated rural development. I mean, you didn't say rural development, but this idea, this integrated approach, which is what we talk about when we say working across different agencies to deliver, especially aspects that are outside agriculture, like healthcare, education, transportation. So that's really appreciated. I remind to everyone that please, if you have questions for Craig, put his name and put your questions in the chat. Craig will be monitoring that and he will be answering questions. And of course, other speakers can join in as the questions come up. We're going to the next speaker. We're taking a different approach. We're Borak Yardemichi. Welcome. I'll turn the floor over to you. I'm going to ask you to keep to time just because we want to leave some time for questions at the end. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Betian. Hello, everyone. My name is Burak Yardımcı. I am attending on behalf of Turkey. I am regional and rural policy expert at the Directorate General for Development Agencies, Ministry of Industry and Technology in Ankara. Before the start, I appreciate to co-host the Netherlands government and OECD CFE team for this worldwide event. It's a great opportunity for us to share our experiences in the context of reimagining the approach to rural economic recovery after massive earthquakes in Turkey. The time is very limited, so I will be very brief. From the outset, I'd like to give a short information about earthquakes that we faced on 6th February of 2023. as you see from the map, 7.6 and 7.7 magnitude devastating earthquakes hit the Turkey. The region is in the southeast part of the country that neighbor to the Syrian border. The earthquakes affected a huge area, 5 not 2 regions, and 11 cities were impacted directly. The region is about 108,000 kilometers square, and over 14 million people were living there. These numbers are approximately equal to 15% of total surface and total population of Turkey. Over 50,000 people lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their relatives and homes. At the same time, economic surveys forecast that the total cost is $103 billion. This is nearly 10% of the national income. When we look at the area from the point of rural policy, the rural population is 3.5 million, 124 districts, and over 5,000 villages are in the region. On the top of it, 3/4 of these districts are predominantly rural. So the picture just after the earthquakes was so gloomy for the region, especially for the rural areas and rural policy. Next slide, please. Now, let me come to the main issues that we gathered today to discuss. I would like to elaborate on designing rural policy, comply with realities, and rethinking the rural economic recovery, lessons, and our implementation. To kick off, after realizing the OECD rural principles in 2019, we have started to transform our national policy align with them. Almost all principles are already adopted by us, but we faced these devastating earthquakes, and most of things reshaped all over again, at least for the one part of the country. What we learned after earthquakes in terms of OECD rural principles are that, firstly, as can be seen from previous disasters around the world, big disasters like we faced hit people differently. Vulnerable people and rural areas impact more. But on the other hand, I can say that rural areas show more resilience than the city centers because a lot of people move to their second or family houses in the villages in the following days after disaster. There are also destroyed buildings in the villages, but rural areas were more attractive to get away from the chaos of urban centers. Secondly, in our case, a big part of the population was living in the city centers, so that emergency aids concentrated in these centers. Emergency services were also generally stated in the town or city centers. But in a disaster like this, a region could be affected totally, and delivering emergency services to the rural areas can be paralyzed, so that the resilience of rural areas, rural services, and rural emergency situations, especially when facing natural disasters like massive earthquakes, floods, wildfires, etc., should be considered in the context of rural proofing. Thirdly, since the occurrence of the disaster, recovering back to the normal, ordinary life as soon as possible is very crucial. From the preliminary hours of the disaster to delivering aid to communities, every daily routine, service, infrastructure, accessing the market probably collapsed because people may have money but they can't buy. The supply chain don't work. It's very clear that we have to think different because if the recovery process stretches, vulnerable people, especially youngs in the rural areas, tend to leave their home and migrate to a second best option, generally to cities. This means a human capacity drain for the rural areas. Next slide, please. To respond to this situation, we followed a short, medium, and long-term recovery path because the damage was massive and recovery will probably take years. In the short term, there were two main items on the agenda. One of them is delivering emergency aids, and the other one is damage assessment. Then in the medium term, we are in now. First off, we prepared post-recovery and urgent action plan for regional development for rapid appraisal and needs assessment studies held in the earthquake region. The main axes of this action plan are repairing infrastructure, supporting employment, and to enable people to return their lives before disaster. On the other hand, once again in this term, rebuilding projects like infrastructure, roads, housing, etc., have started in the region simultaneously with this action plan. Also, economic recovery projects and programs have been started. I will give some examples at the next slide. For the long term, regional development plans were reconsidered and updated by the development agencies in the disaster region. And come to think of it, as I said at the beginning of my speech, the cost of earthquakes will reach more than $100 billion. So the World Bank is the first place. The credit and aid agreements have been dealt with in international funds and institutions. The recovery process in the medium term, the projects and programs for rebuilding physical infrastructure and enhancing economic recovery have been implemented. The region is wide, so different sub-regions and different levels need different requirements. Individual projects reflect this spectrum. As I said before, the region is largely rural and the agricultural sector is predominant in the disaster region. For these, we generally support agricultural production in the region for rural economic recovery. But it is not limited to just primarily agricultural sector. To rebuild the supply chain, to strengthen market access, and to increase rural well-being, social entrepreneurs, cooperatives, firms, and family farming support with programs that aim to create more added value, services, and production. Next slide, please. To wrap up, it is apparent that besides the earthquakes, we faced various natural disasters should be considered, especially on the edge of a climate crisis. Rural principles should be updated in the context of emergency rural services for the rural well-being and supporting rural recovery. Earthquake show us that we have big gaps against the response to affects the natural disasters in terms of the rural service delivery. Therefore, especially merging emergency situation policies to the rural principles must be taught. I hope we will take steps to rebuild more resilient rural areas. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Borak. It's interesting to see the decisions that are being taken after disaster, especially as it affects rural areas. Reminding everyone in the chat, if you have questions for Borak, please put them in the chat, introduce yourself, and put his name so he can see that the question is directed towards him. Of course, it's really interesting to see how the short and medium-term policies are being designed with rural resilience in mind. Our next speakers will be, we'll be hearing from two representatives from the Netherlands, Afki and Ava. I'll turn the floor over to you to talk to us more about rural well-being in the Netherlands and what to do about it from the policy perspective. The floor is yours and your presentation is being loaded now.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. I will start. I'm Afke. I'm from the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Nature. Me and my colleague Eva, we have done some research into how is it going in the rural areas and what are the issues and what are maybe policy options. So we'll talk to you a bit about that today. We don't have much time, so we'll go fast, but please reach out to us through the questions if you want to know more. So why have we done this research in the first place? Like Gerben said earlier, in our rural areas, they're not very remote, but there are still some issues like our water quality and also the nitrogen issue, which affects our nature. And we also have the challenge towards a more sustainable agriculture. But all of that obviously affects also broader the economics, also how people feel about those changes. Maybe there's definitely some resistance as well. So to get to like a just transition, it's important to take into account those broader factors, and really look into that. Like, what do people worry about? Do people really understand what is needed? Why is it needed? Do people maybe worry more about facilities, like what's going on? So that's what we have looked into, also to create our own knowledge base, because there's quite a lot of debate, but also images about how it's going in the rural areas. And we wanted to know like what is true, and also to know maybe what can we do about it. So that was why we did it. So you can go to the next slide, please. Yes, so we have looked into well-being in general, just broad indicators. We've also looked specifically more into how people feel, like more the social side, and of course the economics, and also specifically into the facilities and accessibility, because our rural areas are not maybe as remote as in some other countries, but still less accessible maybe than in cities, obviously. So we've also looked into that, and into the opportunities. So in the next slides, we will like go through these four one by one to give you an idea. So about well-being in general, we have found that rural areas do not have more well-being issues than urban areas. It's more that there's a different pattern. So things that are maybe better in urban areas, maybe a bit less in rural areas, or vice versa. So for example, when you look at rural areas, facilities are a bit further away, and also the economic welfare is a bit less. So yeah, there's changes, but it's not necessarily the case that there's more issues in rural areas. But there's also a nuance that comes with that, in the sense that it's important to look beyond those data, because how do people feel about how is it going? And what is really going on in a certain area? That's not something the data are going to tell you. So it's really important to look further, and also very area specific, into how do people feel. Maybe in one area people think one thing is very, very important that they're lacking, and maybe it's different for a different area. And all those things are beyond the data. And we also felt like, if you look at it, it's very important to, maybe we should like tell a different story, because sometimes it seems like there's this, I don't know, maybe some polarization or divide between like rural and urban areas. But if you look at the structure of the well-being in those areas, it often is the case that those areas need each other. For when you're living in an urban area, you're very happy that you can get access to nature a bit further in the rural area, or culture, vice versa. So maybe we should look at it more like that we provide each other with the services that we lack maybe in our own area, instead of the divide that is sometimes felt. So you can go on in the next slide, please. Wow, I'm going very fast. I hope you can all follow. So we've also kind of looked into the social side, in the sense that here in the Netherlands, there's sometimes this debate about like the social unrest. Like, people sometimes feel, oh, things are not going in the right direction, and like I don't have control over it, and this unease, this kind of societal unease. In the rural areas, this is a bit more, like the percentage is a bit more than in the urban areas, but those are mostly explained by individual level specific, how you say this, individual level characteristics of people. So, but what is very important is that in the social unease that is felt in rural areas, a big component of that unease is the idea that national politics are overlooking their region. Like they're not feeling seen by The Hague, which is our political center. And we call it place-based resentment. So for us, that's more in the rural areas, that's more of an issue than unease in general, because you have that everywhere. But that specific part of the social unrest in the rural areas, that is something we feel like that's not something you want people to feel heard and seen also by the national governments. And we see that they are not always feeling that. So, and we think that is something we can address objectively. Is it the case that we're investing less in rural areas? Like, how can we look at our own like financial and investment mechanics? Can we like somehow get that better? But also, it's a feeling. So how can we deal with that? You know, so I don't have a solution to this. If someone does, please tell me. But we feel like we also need to address that subjective basis, like how can we make people feel heard or seen? And we also feel like the transition that is needed, that I was just talking about nitrogen and water quality. If we do it well, if we make people, if we get people in that transition, if they understand why it's needed, and if we can also like take into account those broader factors, those more social factors and the economics and everything, it can be an opportunity. But it's also a risk in the sense if we don't do it just or right, then it's gonna be a problem more. I'm gonna turn the floor over to Eva now.
Thank you. You can go to the next slide. Yes, I will take over from here. So I will talk a little bit about the economics aspect. Firstly, of course, agriculture is very important for rural areas, but agriculture of rural areas in the Netherlands economically are much more diverse. A lot of people work in services or work in trade. So rural is definitely more than agriculture. But then again, there is a strong relation, of course. So as Gerben and Afka already mentioned, we see some challenges on the agricultural side because of the ecological aspect, like nitrogen. And this influences the economic resilience as well. So there is a vulnerability in this as well, because the impact of the ecological challenges can be quite large for rural areas. So we dived into this in our policy brief. We wanted to look into what the economic challenges impact is for rural areas, and a lot of research institutions looked into this and the socioeconomic impact analysis on the regional level. So we used this information, and it showed that on the short term there is quite an impact, but it also varies per region. So some regions in the Netherlands, they have quite a larger agricultural sector. And also like a lot of firms that are connected to it, like the whole the food chain. But if you look at the long term, the negative impact is not that large. And also on the regional level, for people that do not work in these sectors, there's not a large impact. Whereas it's interesting that the feeling is that the impact is much larger. So again, here we see a disconnect between what people feel and what the data in some ways show. So if we look at the policy opportunities, we think it's very important to look at the future for a resilient economy. So how can we develop diverse rural resilient economies, and focused on what people in specific regions also find important, and how we can use the untapped potential, because we see a lot of regions in the Netherlands that have a lot of qualities, a lot of heritage, a lot of path dependencies that provide specific economic opportunities. But how can we use that? Because if you look at the data, then you see that quite a lot of rural areas are lagging behind the transition towards sustainable and just economies. Cities are often a bit faster with that. So it's also the case, I think, for the Netherlands, that rural innovation is a bit lacking. So how can we, on like a place-based level, of course, we are very good in rural agricultural innovation. But how does it work in the Netherlands? Because we are quite a densely populated country. Urban is quite nearby. So how can we make sure that rural innovation also happens in a way that rural profits, and it doesn't? It also lands with the people in rural areas. You can go to the next slide. We also looked into facilities and accessibility because, of course, it's a very important aspect. It's always you probably all know that it's a very important topic, and it's much discussed, and it's important for having control of your own life, being healthy, being able to connect to people, to jobs. And in the Netherlands, it's also sometimes discussed about a downward spiral. When you look at the data, you do see that facilities are it's shrinking, but we wouldn't want to say there's a downward spiral because quite a lot of the facilities are also disappearing because we use facilities in a different way. There is digitalization. We have a bigger range to reach facilities. We want to reach different kind of facilities. So we want to go to a bigger Albert Heijn supermarket than the smaller one in the village nearby. So it's also the question how we can shape a future-proof way of facilities that links to how people want to use the facilities and how we can shape them in a way that they can also stay there for a longer time. If we look at the accessibility, we see a difference between the actual accessibility and the perceived accessibility. So there was an interesting research from the Rijksuniversiteit Groningen where they looked into that people perceive their accessibility as a bit better than the actual accessibility in rural areas because a lot of people have a car, and if they have a car, they are quite happy with the accessibility. But there's a big vulnerability there, of course, if you don't have a car now, or you might lose your car in the future because you get older, because of the sustainability measurements, a car might be more expensive to have a car on your own. That can influence rural quite a bit more. So it's important to look at those vulnerabilities if it comes to accessibility. And the same counts for services as well. For young people, elderly people, on the aspect of services, there's also more vulnerabilities. So we also think it's important to look on the more people focused policy where you look into what it means for elderly, for younger people, for people that have less means. And lastly, it's important to look at the symbolic, social, and emotional aspect of facilities. There was an interesting research that looked into the emotional aspect that, for example, a primary school that disappears in a village. Some people didn't even use the primary school, but they still had the feeling that when it disappeared, that had a big influence on their lives because the primary school also had multiple functions, but also because it had a feeling of that the future development of the village might change. So if we develop new policy, if we want to change things, then it's very important, we think, to also look into the emotional aspect. So I already mentioned some things for policy opportunities, but we believe it's very important to look at what future-proof ways are that link to what people need, and that also link to what basic facilities that you really need there are proper. And lastly, for us on the national level, the rural proofing aspect is also interesting. So we'll start a discussion with different departments how we can shape a rural proof policy on this way. You can go to the next slide. So the general conclusions, rural areas are doing quite well in the Netherlands, but there are definitely some large challenges, but that also counts for urban. Sometimes there is a feeling, a place-based resentment, as Afke mentioned, that rural is doing less well, but we think they're both doing well. We're quite high up in the countries where if you look at the happiness index, but there are specific challenges that require specific solutions. And one of the aspects is the intentional and emotional aspect. So the place-based resentments, the feelings of deprivation and sense of loss regarding to facilities, we see a difference between how people perceive problems and how, if you look at the data, the problems are there. But we think that it doesn't mean that's not a problem. If a problem is, if people feel like something is a problem, then there is a problem around it. It just says something about how you should tackle a problem and what sort of policy response can work on this. On the tangible issues, there are also specific challenges for rural that we think are very important in the future, such as the vulnerability for services and accessibility and the independence in some cars. vulnerability for specific groups in rural areas, and the vulnerability in the economic structure also in relation to the dependence on the ecological aspect that is has quite some challenges here. And lastly, the risk of increasing issues if we do not try to reach a just transition. So for us, we think it's very important to also look at the socio-economic, socio-cultural side if you want to reach a just transition. Can go to the next slide. So to conclude, I want to say a few things about the general policy opportunities. So for resilient rural areas, we believe it's very important to combine the social, ecological, and economic policies. If you work on only the economic side, but the nature and ecological side is not doing so great, that has a big influence on economics in rural areas because it's so interlinked. And if you don't focus on the social aspects and people are not very happy in rural areas, then the economic opportunities will also not be that large. So the combination of those three in an integrated rural development policy should be important, we believe, and is very important for resilience, where people are happy and where the well-being is improved. And for the Netherlands, we think three aspects are important now to include in this integrated rural development. So firstly, we should look at the past and acknowledge the loss and pain that is experienced in rural areas and the emotional aspect that people feel. Secondly, we should look into the tackling of the current issues in rural areas, focus on how we could rural-proof the national policy, and also look into how we can make sure that the policies of our own ministry connects to the socio-economic and socio-cultural side. And for the future, we should look into a long-term vision for rural areas. So the European Union, of course, has a beautiful vision, but we should maybe look into what that could mean for us. So thank you very much. This was maybe a bit broader than only economic resilience, but we believe that for economic resilience, both the social aspect and the ecological aspects are utmost important because it's a combination of those all.
Thank you for that presentation, and I appreciate the broader view. I think it's important. I mean, this is about the path to economic resilience, and different perspectives on this discussion is what we're looking for. So we appreciate that. Definitely appreciate the focus on looking beyond data. Afka, you have several questions in the chat just about that. So remind you to join the chat and take a look at some of the questions on just transition and what we mean. Reminder, Craig, I know you've been busy answering questions. I do believe, however, that you might have responded just to the host and panelists. So when you're responding to your questions, make sure you click everyone so that everyone sees the questions. Just a reminder. So please go back into the chat. A lot of discussion is happening there. Our next presentation, we're going to switch it. We're going to look now at some of the social aspects and what's being done. So we're going to bring Chile into this discussion. Sebastian Salinas is with us, but he may be having technical problems, but he went ahead and appointed a secondary to help him just in case, because he's in a rural area. So it's either Sebastian or Cristobal who will be doing the presentation. So the floor is yours. Lisa, I need your help to load the presentation.
Thank you very much. Can you listen to me? Yes?
Oh, I can hear you.
It's okay?
We can hear you.
Okay, let us try because of the internet.
Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm Sebastian from Chile. Here I want to talk about assuming the Chilean reality, but also of Latin America. Can you come to the next one, please?
Did we lose you, Sebastian? Sebastian, you're on mute. Take over. Go ahead, Cristobal.
Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Cristobal here. As Betty Ann mentioned, Sebastian is in a very remote area, so I will take over for now. But yes, first, we'd like to talk about some of the rural context that Chile has. So we've heard a lot about different situations around the world. In the case of Chile, we have great disparity between access to housing, for example, in good condition, access to internet, important when it comes to the pandemic, for example, access to health centers, computer station, or even when we see poverty, rural is often much more high than the rest of the urban areas in Chile. And this is important because a lot of times when people think of Chile, they might think of Santiago, or they might think of like one of the biggest economies in Latin America. But the truth is that most of Chile is rural. 83% of the country is rural. So who is tackling the rural issues? That is, and if you can go to the next one, please. That is more or less what we at Balloon are trying to do. We are using entrepreneurship as a means to an end. We're using entrepreneurship to build social capital. We're using entrepreneurship to build participation. And we're using entrepreneurship as a means to reduce the gaps that allow these rural areas to increase their well-being. If you can go to the next one, please. And I'm sorry that we have a lot of slides, so there's going to be a lot of next ones. This is a little snapshot of what our community looks like after over 10 years of work. And if you can go to the next one, please, you will see a bit of how our model works. Entrepreneurship as a means for building trust. Trust is very important in rural context. We're trying to build social capital to more sustainable, more appropriate, more pertinent, and permanent development. You can go to the next one, please. We go doing this through our socio-territorial process. And this process, if you can go to the next one, is what has allowed us to work with several different partners from both the public sector, the private sector, the social sector, and also, next one, please, has allowed us to be recognized by different organizations that have allowed us to keep doing our work. Next one, please. Balloon has, over this 10 years of operation, built 3 main assets around rurality in Chile: the social capital, an articulated community of over 6,000 rural entrepreneurs, and the territorial intelligence that allows us to create new solutions for sustainable development in rural areas. And that is part of the job and the task that we have over at the Balloon Lab. I'm the director of the Balloon Lab. And today we wanted to talk about, and next one, please, about 2 solutions that have something to do around economic benefits and the social side of economics in rural areas. We want to talk about the Rural Development Fund, a solution we created partly because of the pandemic, partly because of the different gaps that entrepreneurs have in rural areas. And then our Community Resilience Index. Next one, please. Let's talk a bit about the Rural Development Fund. Next one. Why the Rural Development Fund? As I think many of you will know, and Chile is no different. It's no different from the rest of the world when it comes to this. Seasonality, informality, the lack of trust when it comes to financial institutions actually wanting to give their products to rural entrepreneurs is a really big deal. And all of these gaps, all of these poverty traps were increased when the pandemic hit. So you had a lot of businesses, rural businesses, who were seasonal, who were informal, having no business, having no customers, having no access to finance to grow their business, to change their business, to make their business much more resilient. Balloon, and next one, please, partnered up with Fundación Avina, Fundación Dinero en Conciencia, who maybe some of you will know from the Banca Ética, the ethical banking, different family offices, and Ashoka, an organization dedicated to promoting social entrepreneurship across the world, to try and create a solution custom fit for the rural context, using trust as a basis to give credit or to give access to finance to rural entrepreneurs who needed to make some investment or to change some part of their business, and they needed the money for in the context of the post-pandemic. Next one, please. What feedback did we have? Many of the rural entrepreneurs, the funding source, I will answer the questions a bit later, by the way. Most of the entrepreneurs were actually able to invest in different opportunities to grow their business or actually expand their business. Next one, please. as they also saw increased sales, so this investments paid off, they were able to make the right investments. And most of the beneficiaries think their business will grow in the future. Next one, please. This is important because when we look at the results, you will see that we have a very low default rate when you consider the high risk profile of these rural entrepreneurs. What we were able to prove by doing the Rural Development Fund, the very first version, is that you can use trust as our basis for successful repayments and allocations in rural contexts in places like Chile. Next one, please. We're actually in the middle of starting the second version of the Rural Development Fund, where we've increased most of the financial structures, and I won't go very much into detail there. And what I think is maybe more interesting is that having these results is also what has allowed us to reach more people, to have more interested investors. And we're offering different ways for these funders to actually participate, some more impact focused, some more philanthropy focused, some more business focused. So we're trying to make the second version of the Rural Development Fund an impact investing mechanism for rural areas. And how did we achieve this, and why are we not changing a lot of the things that we're doing for the second version? Next one, please. And I think this is very, very important for the rural context. We have an ongoing support. We're not just doing money allocations. We're doing follow-ups. We're talking to the people. We're training them. Balloon actually trains them and helps them make the right investments for their business. And this is important in the context of resilience, because we had several cases of entrepreneurs who wanted to invest in one thing, and then there was a flood, there was a wildfire season, there was something that happened that showed them, maybe this isn't the right investment I thought, maybe I have to invest in this other thing to protect my business, to grow my business, to make my business more resilient. Next one, please. We are also increasing the diversification of the fund. We're actually going to be tackling more regions than the ones that we have over here. These are the results of the very first one. And we're also, a lot of rural entrepreneurs that we work with are women. So we have an organic gender bias towards our allocations. And next one, please. The final one, and I think this also ties into the ongoing support bit, is that we are trying to build social capital and rural business intelligence as we go about doing this. This is the only way, and this means having a very flexible approach to the allocations, to how we actually do the work over time, to actually get success and have the successful repayments that will also allow us to build. And next one, please. The future vision that we have for the fund. We would like to have a growing fund that is self-sustained and that allows us to continuously do allocations for these rural entrepreneurs to hopefully have them grow their business and maybe also have them become formal and access traditional financing tools by helping them make the right resilience investments. This is what we wanted to tell you about the Rural Development Fund, and this is also what ties into our next project, which is the Community Resilience Index. Next one, please. I think everybody knows that we are in a very tough worldwide climate context. Next one, please. And this is also the case for Chile. 54% of Chile's population is exposed to 3 or more climate or natural threats. And only 8 of the 346 communes in Chile have an approved disaster risk reduction plan. So when we think about policy, we're here seeing an example of policy maybe not necessarily working as we intended. We have funding gaps to get these plans. We have funding gaps to get the teams to actually do all of this. And the result, next one, please, is what we see how despite the SDGs, for example, having clear targets and goals around this. Next one, please. We see these effects. These are 3 pictures of balloon communities where not having these plans, not having these policies be effective has these kinds of results. On the upper left side, we see the effects of wildfires. On the below that picture, we see a big landslide that by an inch did not like destroy this house. And on the right side, we see the effects of last year's floods in the Mali region. And I think a big part of what is also important here is that Balloon is an organization that works, we're a practitioner organization. We are in the territory. Our office flooded, so we saw the effects ourselves. We lived it. This is a new phase of territorial inequality that we see because of not having of these plans. And next one, please. When we talk about this, we also need to understand what we're facing. So when we talk about resilience, when we talk about disaster risk reduction, we're talking about risk. And risk is an equation. If it's an equation, that means it can be measured and that it can be changed. But how can we lower risk? How can we increase resilience if we have no baseline information? As we started working on these topics, we realized that is a really big gap. The policy framework exists. The goals exist. There's no information. We need to build information to do the right investments and to actually move the needle. Next one, please. We believe that Balloon, being a practitioner organization with a permanent presence on rural territories, is what allows us to be a great asset with the government, with the private sector on the preparedness for any disaster or climate shocks, and also on the resilient recovery, the resilient development that we're aiming for in the long term. Next one, please. We have done different pilots of social technologies that allow us to understand more of the true disaster, the true risk in rural communities. And our Community Resilience Index is an answer to how many of the development agencies' standardized instruments are often too deep and, at the end of the day, impractical for rural context. What we're trying to do with the Community Resilience Index is make a practical set, less deep, more broad, of standardized baseline information of a community's preparedness. Next one, please. The Community Resilience Index has 5 key dimensions and 43 indicators. Our first iteration of the Community Resilience Index being focused on the public sector. The public sector as a means to measure a community's resilience. So we're very much focused on how Chile's policy and how Chile's preparation can work. But we know, and this has been said in many other resilience-related instances, we cannot expect the public sector to cover every single need that resilience requires, that resilient development requires. So our next iteration, which is already in development, will place a greater focus on the private sector's involvement. The agility and the access to capital that the private sector has can be a great leverage if it works in tandem with the public sector in places like Chile. Next one, please. And it comes down to some very practical things like what we see here. This comes from our initial application of the index and some of our social technologies, where we realized that providing, for example, a community with a VHF radio equipment, which in Chile costs around $500, can make a difference in how communities can actually communicate in the face or in the event of a disaster or an emergency. If we were, for example, to distribute 4 of these radios in the strategic places of a territory, we can make them be able to communicate when there's no telecommunications, when there's no access to roads to travel, just to have that communication actually happen in the local level, regional level, national level. These practical use cases are what we're trying to achieve to get a baseline off with our index. But at the end of the day, it makes no sense to know what's the needle that you have to move if you're not going to be able to move it. And that requires investment. Next one, please.
Sorry, Cristobal, just to check, would you be able to wrap up in the next?
Yeah, we're wrapping up.
Thank you.
What we're trying to do at the end of the day is have this triple dividend focus. And by measuring how you can move the needle and make the right investments that allow you to reduce and avoid loss, but also create economic and social gains, we can actually create resilience. So we're trying to build the biggest baseline in Chile to make the right resilient investments. And the next one is the final one. or the almost final one. Our aim is to implement the Community Resilience Index across all 346 communes of Chile by using this baseline information to make disaster risk reduction and resilience relevant, to trigger frugal and bottom-up resilience investments for sustainable development for everybody. The next one is the final one. I'm replacing Sebastian, so his email is here. But if you think you can make this case study, case use for Latin America, Chile, and the world, we are extremely happy to talk. And also thank you, everybody, for having us here.
Thank you so much. That's very, very interesting. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to run into the next speaker and ask them to just keep it to time to allow our last speaker to have enough time before we have to end the webinar. So turning over to Jaroslav and Ursula to talk to us a bit more and give us another perspective on the social response to this. And your slide is coming up now.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think I'm going to start and then I will hand over to Jaroslav. So my name is Ursula Budzik-Tabor and I'm working for the Rural Pact Support Office. So just to explain, if the Rural Pact is an action by the European Commission to implement or to help in the implementation of the rural vision to 2040. And we're trying to mobilize stakeholders and we try to also provide them with good practices and possibility of exchange. And as a matter of fact, one of the first events that we organized as a Rural Pact was on social economy. And then that's when we invited Jarosław from Poland to present his project. That's why, that's where the connection comes from, that we're actually working together on that. And I could ask for the next slide, Lisa. So I just wanted to briefly explain the context of this project, because we are now speaking from a very local level. We're talking about one local area in Poland, in central Poland. It's one of the poorest remote rural areas in Poland, but there is also a national context that has to be understood. And there are two important aspects. One is this European initiative of LEADER and community-led local development, which is a way of granting the power to the local community to decide how they want to develop, where they want to go, and how they want to spend the money they're receiving. And that in Poland started actually already since early 2000. So before Poland became a member of the European Union, by a series of initiatives to create local partnerships, what's called partnership groups. And then already in 2003, so 1 year before Poland's accession, there was a large-scale capacity building of local communities with preparatory action and training and other forms of support, which actually is continuing a little bit by the Polish Rural Forum until the present. And so from the very beginning, when Poland became an EU member in 2004, the LEADER funding was available to rural areas, and the government has started and is continuing its commitment to continue funding LEADER groups and to improve the functioning of the LEADER approach. So I think that's very important, because you're going to speak, Jarek is going to speak about the perspective of a local LEADER group as one of his factors of success of what he's going for the social economy. Another factor is that to be remembered is that social economy as such is a very big topic for Poland and for rural, say, civil society and civil society generally, not just rural. There was a strong mobilization of civil society around the topic of social economy, and there was a very supportive legal framework put in place. I have heard several points of view that after Italy, Poland is probably the country where social economy has the best legal framework, and is really a very, very important aspect of economic development. And there is the law on social cooperative from 2006, and there was different laws related to organizations of public benefit, and a very recent law on social enterprise. So there are clear legal forms which these organisms can take, and that facilitates their tax situation and so on. And there is also a network of social economy support centers across the country which help local initiatives to develop local enterprises and so on. For the next slide then, so that we start, and that's what I will hand over to Jarek in a moment. Back in 2002, and I came to this area for the first time in 2003, actually, where, as I said, a very poor, remote, rural area where very, very little was happening. No water, no water supply, no sewage, no cultural center, nothing. Very, very high unemployment, because that was the time when the, let's say, old communist style industries were going bankrupt and people were losing their jobs massively. And so we are in this small rural municipality where nothing is happening until all of a sudden those two things, the creation of the local partnership and the leader approach, together with social economy, come together and things start to change. And that's how I hand over to Jarek to continue the story.
Thanks a lot, Ula. Hello, I am Jarek from Poland. I am president of the local action group Circle Flint, and sorry for my English is not quite good. It's a little bit challenge for me to explore you about the Baltov. We started, the local people invite me to Baltov to help them at 2002. And I, of course, said, okay, I will help you. And we started with two reasons. One is the local partnership between three sectors, the government, the non-government organization, and the business, of course, local business. And the second term was social enterprise, it's economy, social economy. And we developed the local economy based on the coherent tourism product because the region, like said Ula, was very, very, very poor. It's one of the poorest region in Poland, and in this east part of Poland, we was in 2002 really, really, really poor. We need for start with first activities was create jobs and reduce unemployment, because the employment was next to 40%. Build the community spirit and restore heritage, because in this area we haven't any association, any local musician band, and local fire station association. Of course, we think about improve infrastructures to facilitate business development. And one for us was the most important, one of the most important way. Of course, we want to create local association for would make this area of people who living in this area happen. Please, next slide. We started with first touristic products that was rafting on the local river. It was the first rafting in Poland for the local river in Poland. Therefore, many people from Poland and media, social media was very interesting how we made this in this poor area. The second step was very, very, very big challenge for us. We started build ideas and real first Jurassic Park in Poland. It was in 2002. And every next year we started with new touristic attraction. And the third was a horse riding center, Next, we think about the touristic season in Poland. It was usually the summer, but we want to save the place for workers, not only in summer, but we want to save the carefully place for workers, the same in the winter. Therefore, we started in 2006 with winter sport. And every year, we started with new attraction, and we stopped with a new attraction until 2012. We had questing, Oceanarium, 3D, cinema. And the first year, when we started with rafting, Baltov visitors, 14,000 tourists. It was really absolutely record. Now we have every year in the village where living has habitants 600 in Baltov, not local government, but local area, but in Baltov village living just 600 habitants. Therefore, we every year have a 500,000 tourists in the every year. Is the biggest result in the Świętokrzyskie region. Please again, next. Oh, now the Baltov touristic attraction look like in this picture. We have 25 attraction in this area. This area is about 120 hectares. It's the biggest in Poland, Polish touristic area in one place. Next, please. What was the most important? About showing faster per capita income growth than other municipalities in the area. Multiple new business emerging, including 35 rural tourism farms. It was the very important working with the people who living in the village, in the area, and they have houses. No children, because the children immigrate to the Warsaw, Krakow. Therefore, they prepare the house for the touristic. We started in 2002 with 6 jobs created, but when we finished first season, we had 18 person who working for the association, Bout Association. Now, just in the summertime, in the Jurassic Park, working 300, we have 300 jobs. But next to the Jurassic Park is, I think that is next 200 jobs, because many people have hotels, restaurants, etc., etc. Next, please. Why we thinking about the social economy and why the social economy is very important for development of Baltov region. The association Balt, they created in 2002, focusing on social and community action, culture, tradition, intergeneration, integration, and incubation, many people and many activities. And we create an association Balt, create next association Delta, started in 2004, and the association Delta focusing on the investment and business management, czyli that's Jurassic Park. And 2005, we had in Poland European program European program Equal, when we tasted Polish style of social enterprise, social economy. And we pozyskać, Ula? Pozyskać?
We obtained
money for from these projects Equal for testing Polish style of social enterprise, and we started with social enterprise Allozaur, and the Allozaur now is going to the future and working, and now I think that 25 person as workers in social enterprise Allozaur. Next, please. You have two pictures with people who was unemployment in 2006, and we had 5 or 4 levels tested for these people who want to work for Allozaur Association. But we had now money for, we funded money for 14 person. But on the first meeting, we had 140 persons who want need a work. Next, please. Strong local roads. It's very, very, very important for us when we started in 2002 and now. A development based on local assets, including dinosaurs' footprints in the nearly hills, organization with the community and for the community of festivals, fairs, cultural events, free access for inhabitants to use local attractions, bonus for ambassadors. Local searching, animal feed purchased from local farmers, activities targeting local youth. We have local youth groups, name Junior Bout, and Center of Volunteer now we have. And revitalization of historical building or spaces for this 20 years. Of course, we needed money for this development and changing. You have here some proposal for this money who we use. Equal Polish programs, pre-accession funds before when Poland was in the European Union, SAPART, FARE, rural development program leader, the Ula said about this, Swiss aid for Poland, and many others sites of funding for the Bałtów. Next, please. Some factors of long-term sustainability. Strong leadership, it's of course very, very, very important for us, including people with business experience. Several organizations with complementary roles, wide range of funding sources, not dependent on any single source, well connected both locally and beyond, nationality and transnationality cooperation and programs. Next, please. I think that we're finished. Okay, thank you very, very, very much. If Ula want to say something, please.
No, I think you've said everything. I'm just ready also to help answer further questions.
I think a lot of questions are going into the chat, so I would encourage you. I think you're already addressing some of them, so please pay particular attention to that. I know in the interest of time and we're about to run over, but I want to just go right in and give our last colleague the floor to give the German perspective on bioenergy, different perspective, which I think is very important to this conversation around resilience. The floor is yours. And you are sharing your screen. Not sure we can hear you. Hamut?
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the floor. And I was asked to give a practical example of sustainable development in rural areas. And my examples are the bioenergy villages. An example which is developed in the context of LEADER, and I'm very happy that Ursula already gave some basic information about this EU program for rural development. But I want to focus on the background, the real basis of LEADER, and this is the realization that people themselves know best about their needs and the needs of their rural areas. And this is really a message I want to give you. And this is very often an aspect which is only seen in the context of life quality or well-being. But I think it's also very, very important in terms of economic development and rural development as a whole. And also these things have to be orientated on the people's needs. That means attractive local jobs. That means reasonable income. And that means that these economic activities have to be in harmony with local natural resources. I will give you one example. We had this example of tourism. Sometimes tourism projects are very much focused on a big scale, and the jobs created are only with very low salary and for people who come only for the season and are away from the region after this season. So I think this is not a sustainable way of economic development of rural areas. Yes, to just give you a short impression, yes, also in Germany there are rural areas, and this is a low mountain area I'm talking about. It's near the city of Göttingen. I want to now give you a short impression of the technical aspect of the biogas plant, which is the basis of this project. And the situation was at that time it was developed that the prices for the crops of the farmers had decreased so much that it was no longer reasonable for them to sell them on the market. And on the other hand, the prices for energy they rised a lot, so the energy got very expensive. And the idea was to use biomass from the farms, but also waste, organic material or manure from the cattle to feed a biomass plant with it, to produce biogas, and to drive an engine with this gas to produce energy with a generator. This was a system which was introduced and was working, but at the end, along with this technical situation, there was an amount of 40% of waste heat, energy which was not used. And the idea then was to use this energy and to use this for the heating of the houses of our villages. It then needs a wheat chillet grid, which is quite expensive, and in most cases, to also cover the very cold days in winter, it needs some additional heating facility. This was mostly made with wood chips, which was integrated in the whole system. But you can imagine if this village heat grid should work economic, it needs a lot of people. It needs more than 50% of the village houses to be involved in the project. Otherwise, it would be too expensive. So this was the big challenge of this project. And we in the local government, we started a LEADER project. And the first village before we made it to a LEADER project, the first bioenergy village was called Yunde, the village of Yunde, which was already working, and we wanted to copy the system to more villages in our region. And we started with a competition which aimed to find the villages who had the best requirements to follow this way. And after this competition with 34 villages participating, we financed 9 feasibility studies to find out which is the most economic way to implement this bioenergy idea. And at the end, 4 new bioenergy villages take place. So there were very intensive phases to get into the implementation, the initiation, what I told you that we needed nearly the whole inhabitants of the village to be part of the project. That means a lot of information and to motivate the people to participate, to be part of the project. The next phase was the planning phase, to find a way to really have a model that is on long term reasonable. And at last, the last phase was the building phase, building of the biogas plant, the building of wood chip furniture, and to build the village heat grid. What I want to show with the photo on the left side is to show you the participation of the village people. And that means not only to participate, but to make the project their own. This was the most important step we tried to get in. And I think we had villages where 200 people out of, to give you an impression of the size, all the villages had about 200 to 600 inhabitants. So not so much. And you can imagine that it's not easy to convince them to throw their old heating technology based on oil away and to trust that the new way will be functional. And I want to show you the amount of resources we needed in the different phases with this table. That means, especially in the village, we needed a lot of engagement all over the whole periods. And we needed most financing resources at the beginning in the initiation phase. We worked very close together with the university, but also with consultants to show the people what could be a way and to support them when they took over the project, when they made it to their own project and tried to find their own way of solution. This now is a kind of example of a financing model. It shows not the real numbers. It's most of the projects were much more expensive, but it should show you how much money it was, and it was a lot of money for a village of, let's say, 600 people. And the challenge was now to find a financing model for these. And as you can see, also in the financing aspect, it was the village who took the most important part. One part in cooperative shares, that means all the projects were run by cooperatives. Cooperatives of those who were the consumers of the energy, and on the other hand, who were the producers of the organic material that was needed to drive the biogas plants. And you see that there are loans of more than 1 million, and that means it's a very high responsibility for those in the cooperative who took over the responsibility as president or chairman or whatever. And yes, I think it was this was really really good to see that there were that people were found to say yes, who said yes, I can do that, and I will be the one who is going forward and take over the responsibility. On the other hand, there was some federal, some subsidies from the federal government and from LEADER, from the Rural Development Fund of the EU. And this again should show you these pictures, that the engagement of the people, this is the most important factor to make it a success. As long as as the people do not feel that this is what they want by their own, that this is their own project, they won't never be successful in implementing. And you see this where some photos from the starting phase. Yeah, it was very exciting because you can imagine to have such a high invest for a small village with this high risk that makes it exciting. Now we come to the aspects of sustainability. What does these projects mean for regional development? It was this high grade of participation, of activating the village people, that makes it successful on the one hand, but was also the base for the next project for the village. If there's one project which a village had implemented successfully, they immediately have the idea to do the next one. I don't go into detail now because the time is running, but I just pick up some of these. That is, for example, the increase of the income diversity, because also for the farmers on the one hand, who had a new possibility to sell their crops, but also, as you can imagine, jobs in these biogas plants were created. And then one of the main facts was, and effects was, the independency of fossil fuel, because the prices for these fossil fuels for heating were increasing tremendously. For the farmers, this model, this project meant a long-term price stability, a better utilization of arable land and higher income. They could have various earlier harvest dates, and a better utilization of machines because they had less working peaks. And for me, the most important effects were the ecological demands. That was a high reduction of CO2 emission, an increasing of plant diversity when producing biomass, a reduction of soil erosion and nitrite leaching, minimizing of pesticide treatments, and you can use the residues of the biogas plant for fertilization again. That means you have a nutrient circle with nitrogen, for example. You only take out the carbon parts of the crops. So you see, it's a win-win-win situation, a lot of positive effects on rural development, but also on as a method or a project to reduce CO2 emission and to increase climate saving. Yes, and this is the result. And I want to repeat again that the most important success factor is to make it a people's project. And the people themselves, they have so much power in our villages, I can say, so much power. And this power can be used for rural development and can be used for the transition, which is necessary with respect to climate change. And all the efforts we are doing in Germany to increase the amount of regenerative energies, they are all, these energies are all produced in the rural areas. But we must do this transition in a way that the return of the investments are in the rural areas and not by those who are investing somewhere else in the world. So this should be my my short message at the end of this workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harmet, for a really interesting presentation. You have a number of questions in the chat, so I would ask you to take a look. I'm mindful that we are, obviously we ran over, but I would like to give everyone space for at least 1 or 2 questions. So from our participants who are still with us, please, maybe a show of hand if you have a burning question for the panel. We've shared quite a bit today, and I know you've been in the chat, but if you haven't had a chance to share your question in the chat and you'd like to ask it now, please raise your hand. And while you are doing it, just to let you know that we're recording. We're going to post and make available the presentations and also the recording. So I see a number of questions about that in the chat. Those will be available to you probably in a week or 2. So and Lisa, I on my screen can't see anything, so I don't want to say we don't have any questions, or if everyone feels their questions were asked and answered, that is fine too. Otherwise, I'm happy to say that this raised a lot. I saw William Parnell did a very convincing summary, so he did my job, because he also listed in the chat 4 key messages that he's taken away from this discussion. So I invite you to take a look at that. This was really, really very interesting. We will be bringing on board, for me, what I heard was the importance of integrated rural development, the interest of investing more in the social economy and what that could do in helping rural areas, making sure that there's buy-in from people. I think that's a very strong message. Looking beyond data, that's another key message that emerged. The importance of rural proofing and what does it mean and when do you rural proof? And also for communities, and Chile and Turkey raised this point, disaster resilience, and also how do you do resilience after a disaster? So those are some key points. I'm sure there are many, but I want to thank all the speakers for their participation today. And we will, obviously, if there are any follow-up questions, feel free to email that to me and I will share it with the speakers to keep the conversation going. But thank you very much for your time. And I will close the webinar here. Thank you again to the speakers. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.